Om Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Sahavidyan Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Chaitanyam sarvagam sarvam sarvabhuta guhashayam yat sarva vishayatitam tasmai sarva vide namaha. Welcome back. We continue our study of Upadesha Sahasri, and the opening part of the text has this collection of very short chapters, and that's actually kind of delightful because you get a different perspective, a different peek, so to speak, on the teachings of Advaita in each of these short chapters. And today we get a very different peek, so to speak. The chapter 7, the title is Buddhi Arudha. Prakarana means chapter. Arudha means arisen, that which is arisen in your buddhi, in your intellect. And you'll see that the perspective Sri Shankara takes in this text is that whatever arises in your buddhi is known to you. It is revealed by your consciousness, illumined by that consciousness. Now, to introduce this chapter properly, when experiences arise in your buddhi, like this experience right now as we're having this class, when that experience arises in your buddhi, it's revealed by your consciousness. That's your own experience, right? But you think it's a really normal, ordinary experience. You think it's an ordinary experience because you don't truly appreciate the nature of the consciousness that's revealing what's happening in your mind right now. Suppose you really got it, that the consciousness which is revealing the activities of your mind is identical to the consciousness revealing the activities of my mind. Suppose you really got it, that the consciousness that you think is yours is in fact universal, all-pervasive. Suppose you really got that. How would that change your perspective right now? You might get a little sense of it right now. You say, whoa, this is not an ordinary experience by any means. Now, experience, in fact, I think my guru liked to use these words. Experience is as good as your interpretation of it. You can interpret this as a very ordinary experience, but an enlightened person will have a very different interpretation. And that's the subject matter of today's class. How does an enlightened person interpret what you think is an ordinary experience that arises in your mind? And just to finish this introduction, many times we've already discussed that the teachings of Vedanta have this threefold foundation of Shruti, Yukti, and Anubhava. Shruti, scriptural revelation; Yukti, reasoning; and Anubhava, experience. We've discussed this at least several times. And so far the text has been primarily focused on Shruti. Actually, it's covered all three. But this Anubhava, as we've discussed, is one of the three, but that Anubhava itself is twofold. And I think this is a topic, I don't remember that I've ever taught this before. And it comes up very nicely here. Anubhava at one level is your personal experience. That's Anubhava. But then there's the experience of an enlightened person. Very different. So we have two kinds of Anubhava. Actually, it's one kind of Anubhava, but two kinds of interpretation. And today, our topic is the experience of an enlightened person. Anubhava means experience, so this would be called v1-6, the experience of an enlightened person. And as I said, more specifically, how an enlightened person interprets an ordinary experience like that. So, like this. So, with this introduction, let us begin. Buddhyarudham sada sarvam, buddhyarudham sada sarvam, drishyate yatra tatra va, drishyate yatra tatra va, maya tasmat param brahma, maya tasmat param brahma, sarvagnyashchasmi sarvagaha, sarvagnyashchasmi sarvagaha. Sarvam, everything you experience. Sada is always. Buddhi arudham, arisen in your mind, in your buddhi. Everything you experience is that arises in your mind. Sada drishyate. It is always perceived. Yatra tatra va. Whatever it is, wherever it may be, at any possible time, whatever it is, that those activities that arise in your mind, the experiences that arise in your mind are sada drishyate. They are always perceived. They are always revealed. And he uses a first person pronoun here, maya, by me. So these are the words of an enlightened person. We understand that from context. So the enlightened person says in the first person, whatever arises in my mind, in fact, he didn't say my mind, the mind. Whatever experiences that arise in the mind are revealed by me. Notice he didn't say revealed by consciousness. Why? Because for the enlightened person, it's so obvious that my true nature is consciousness. So it sounds a little bit odd to say revealed by consciousness, where it's more direct to say revealed by me, maya. Tasmat in the next sentence. Therefore, actually, what a big leap here. Therefore, in the middle of the last line, asmi, I am param brahma. I am the ultimate reality called Brahma. I am sarvagnaha. I am all-knowing, omniscient, and I am sarvagaha, all-pervasive. How did he get there? Tasmat, therefore. Whatever experiences arise, I will paraphrase the whole thing. All experiences arise in the mind, and all those experiences are illumined or revealed by me. Therefore, how does he make that jump? Therefore, I am all-pervasive and all-knowing. And here, this is the vidvat anubhava, the perspective, an enlightened person, one who knows this fundamental truth. And that is, all limitations belong to your mind. When you experience, I'm going to find some right language here. When you experience something, that experience is finite, right? We don't have infinite experiences. We have finite experiences. When you look up at the sky, that's not an infinite experience. Or actually, at night, there are a finite number of stars visible to your eyes. All experience is finite. All experience is limited. Why? Because your mind is limited. Who has an infinite mind? The buddhi by nature is finite, is limited. Therefore, everything you experience is limited. And now the logic that's going to be developed in this chapter is this. All limitations belong to the buddhi. All finitude, all limitations belongs to the buddhi and not to you, the consciousness that illumines the buddhi. Meaning, by contrast, if limitations belong to the buddhi, the consciousness that illumines the buddhi must be free from those limitations. The consciousness that reveals the activities in your buddhi is in fact limitless, infinite, boundaryless, vast, unborn, uncreated, all-pervasive. This is the logic, and it's going to be developed as we go along in this chapter, but as our starting point. All limitations belong to the buddhi. No limitations belong to atma. Atma, your true nature, is truly limitless. He uses a term here, param brahma. We usually use Brahma as a term for the underlying reality because of which everything exists. He's using it here, Shankara is using it here in a slightly different sense as a synonym for Paramatma. Paramatma means the limitless consciousness, the universal consciousness, not your consciousness, but limitless universal consciousness. So whenever you see the word Brahma in this chapter it kind of means Paramatma. It means that limitless consciousness. So with this beginning, let us proceed. Yathatma-buddhi-charanam, yathatma-buddhi-charanam, sakshi tadvat pareshvapi, sakshi tadvat pareshvapi, naiva podhum navadatum, naiva podhum navadatum, shakyastasmad parohyaham, shakyastasmad parohyaham. Yatha, in the same way that atma-buddhi-charanam, of the chara here means activities, charana, of the activities of buddhi, of the intellect. And here the word atma simply means one's own. Be careful. That word atma doesn't always mean sat-chit-ananda atma. Sometimes it just means me, one's own. Here grammarians call it a reflexive pronoun, oneself. And here atma has that sense. So atma buddhi means one's own intellect. So referring then to the activities of one's own intellect, he says, yatha, just as sakshi, and you have to, actually the subject of the sentence is the last word of the verse, aham. Aham, I, sakshi, I am the witness. You all know that word. I am the witness of all of the activities of my mind, yatha, just as I am the witness of all of the activities of my mind, tadvat, in the same way, I am the witness of pareshu api, of the activities of all other minds. That's an interesting way of putting it. Just as I am, and he uses the first person, I am the sakshi, witness. Just as I am the witness of the activities of this buddhi, in the same way I am the witness of the activities of all buddhis. Of course, this leads to the question that's asked again and again, and that is, you'll ask, if my consciousness also illumines your mind, why don't I know your thoughts? That's a common question. We've actually dealt with that a number of times. So if you understand from these verses and from our prior classes that your consciousness is equally present behind your thoughts and my thoughts, then the question comes, why can't we know the thoughts of other minds? You might remember my answer, and my answer went like this. Who is asking that question? Does consciousness ask that question? Or is that question arising in your mind? Consciousness doesn't ask that question. In fact, that question is known to consciousness, right? So that question, why don't I know your thoughts? That question belongs to your mind. That question is illumined by consciousness. The question that belongs to your mind is different than thoughts that belong to my mind. Our minds are absolutely separate. It happens that they're illumined by the same consciousness, but it's like, the metaphor we've used for this all-pervasiveness of consciousness. One metaphor we've used is the sun shining on many buckets of water. One sun, many reflections. Well, the reflections of one bucket don't affect the reflections of another bucket. If you think of, remember the metaphor? This is a bucket, and the mind within represents the water. So in this bucket, there's water, and that water has a reflection in the form of, why don't I know your thoughts? Reflections are vrittis, right? So that question, why don't I know your thoughts, is a vritti that belongs to your intellect, which is like a ripple in a particular bucket. And that ripple is separate then from all other buckets. Your vrittis are separate from those of all other minds. Okay, enough said. Then he concludes here. Not concludes, he makes a very powerful statement. He says in the second half, na eva apodhum, na va adatum shakyaha. In the last line, na shakyaha. It is not possible, apodhum, to negate what? That sakshi. That sakshi, the consciousness which is all-pervasive, the sakshi which is illumining the activities of all minds. He says, it is not possible to negate it. Na shakyaha apodhum. Apodhum means to negate. Why is it not possible to negate anything? We'll go back, this is like in our Bhagavad Gita class, we talk about knower and known. Here, let's talk about negator and negated. So, what can be negated? Whatever is different from the negator can be negated. What can be negated? You close your eyes, I'm negated, right? So, anything known to you as an object can be negated. Simply put, all objects can be negated. And this is negation in a philosophical sense. So, which means negated as being a transient object, part of the universe, and different from me. So, negator, negated. Anything known to you is an object, and philosophically speaking, all objects can be negated. They're finite, they're limited, they come and go. There are all kinds of philosophical reasons to say that all objects can be negated. So, then everything that you experience, anything known to you, can be negated because you are the negator, the consciousness, which is separate from the negated. So what is he saying here? Is it possible to negate the negator? That's his point. Anything known to you can be negated. You cannot negate yourself as consciousness. That consciousness is unnegatable. He uses some fairly abstract language here, but remember, this is Shankara. And this is Shankara not at an introductory level, but he is revealing the strength of these teachings. So, consciousness is na shakyaha, it's not possible, apodhum, to negate that consciousness. The negator cannot be negated, nor, he says, na shakyaha nava, nor is it possible to adatum. The kind of the opposite of negate is to grasp. So we're done with this negation part. What about grasping part? Well, again, you have that which is grasped and the one doing the grasping. We're back to the same logic. That which is grasped is an object. That which is graspable is an object. Notice again, he's using some fairly sophisticated reasoning here. That which can be grasped is an object. You, the one doing the grasping, the consciousness behind the act of grasping, that consciousness is not graspable, it's not an object. What he's doing here is just making this subject-object division so clear and applying it in this context. So your nature as all-pervasive consciousness cannot be negated, nor can it be grasped, understood like any other object, because your consciousness is not an object. So we make a distinction of what is the word? Unviolable? I'm not sure if that's the right word. A distinction which can never be overcome. And that is the distinction between subject and object, the distinction between knower and known. Tasmat, therefore, he concludes, paraha hi aham. Therefore, aham, I am, paraha, and here paraha, like Brahma, would point to Paramatma, all-pervasive, universal consciousness. He continues. Vikaritvam ashuddhatvam, vikaritvam ashuddhatvam, bhautikatvam na chatmanaha, bhautikatvam na chatmanaha, ashesha buddhi sakshitvat, ashesha buddhi sakshitvat, buddhivat buddhivat-chalpa vedana, buddhivat-chalpa vedana. He expands on what he just taught in the prior verse. He says in the end of the second line, nacha atmanaha. Atmanaha, for atma, for consciousness, your true self. Na, and that na is going to apply all over the place. He says, na vikaritvam. There is no changeability. Atma does not possess changeability. We've had this discussion several times. The changes that take place in your experience belong to your mind. The ever-changing activities of your mind are revealed by unchanging consciousness. You've heard me say that before. Here it comes once again. Consciousness is unchanging. Like the sun is unchanging. It's the unchanging revealer of activities that happen on the planet. In the same way, consciousness, your consciousness, is the unchanging light of awareness that reveals the constantly changing conditions in your buddhi, in your mind, in your intellect. So, atmanaha, for atma, consciousness, your true self, na vikaritvam, there's no change. Also, na ashuddhatvam, there's no impurity for atma, which means the impurities of your mind don't affect consciousness. We've given this example so many times. The sun is not affected by what it shines upon. When the sun shines upon a garbage dump, the sun doesn't become impure in any sense by shining on that garbage dump. In the same way, when there are impurities in your mind, and there always are, the consciousness that reveals the impurities in your mind, that consciousness remains utterly untainted by those impurities, and that consciousness, of course, is you. Your fundamental nature is unaffected by the problems of your mind, by the impurities of your mind. Also, one more, in fact, we got two more things here. Third thing, atmanaha, for atma, na bhautikatvam. Literally, made of that which is made of elements is bhautika. So here, physicality is quite a good translation. There is no physicality to atma. I don't think that needs to be explained further. And there's one more, though, in the last line. So skip ahead. And he says, na, and that na atmanaha applies throughout this verse. For atma, there is no, you see that cha alpa vedana. We have to break those words apart. It's not chalpa, but cha alpa. There is no alpa vedana. There is no, alpa means little. Vedana, knowledge. There is no limited knowledge for atma, buddhivat, like the mind. Your mind, as we said in a prior verse, all limitations belong to buddhi and not to the consciousness that illumines buddhi. So this is so he negates four things. Atma doesn't have changeability. Atma doesn't have impurity. Atma doesn't have physicality. And Atma doesn't have limitations of any kind, including limitations of knowledge. Why? He concludes in the third line, ashesha buddhi sakshitvat. Because that consciousness is the sakshi, the witness of ashesha buddhi, all buddhis. Ashesha means without exception. So the consciousness which is the illuminer of all buddhis, that which has no edge or boundary. We've had, just to remind you, we've had this discussion before, that your consciousness is not stuck inside you. Let's just refer to this. This is Shankara's teaching this at a very high level. I'd like to bring it down just for a moment to a little bit more experiential level, and that is, you might argue that I don't experience my consciousness as being all-pervasive. I only experience myself as consciousness within this body. My sentience seems to end right here at the edge of the skin. So below this point, I am there. Beyond this point, I am not there. This is conventional thinking, right? So this is the edge right here. This is the edge of my existence. That's conventional wisdom, and it's ridiculous. There are so many easy ways to explain why. Look at this. Have you ever fallen asleep like this, and you wake up in the middle of the night, and your your arm is absolutely numb. It feels like it's not me, right? When you were awake, it felt like me. Now that it's numb, it feels like not me. Does that make sense? Would you really say this is not me? No, it is me. Then what is it that changed? Notice that before it fell asleep, you could sense the response to the nerves that are throughout the hand. Right now, after you've fallen asleep, this becomes numb. There's no nervous sensation. Therefore, we've got this funny idea in our head that is, wherever I have nervous sensation, I am there. How's that? Because that's what it feels like. If you don't have nervous sensation here, it feels like I'm not here. If you do have nervous sensation, it feels like I am here. You might remember I gave this really weird science fiction kind of fantasy, and that is if somehow the nerves would grow through my skin and penetrate this chair. Imagine. It's weird, I know, but you can get the idea. Suppose the nerves grew through my skin and penetrated this chair. If that happened, if I touched the chair, it would feel the same as touching my arm. These examples show how arbitrary it is when we say, I end here. All you're talking about is nerves. How arbitrary is that? So we have to understand that, and it comes back to one of my favorite topics, experience fools us again and again and again. To feel like you are consciousness stuck inside of this is an artifact of your experience. Your experience fools you into thinking your consciousness is stuck inside. In fact, your consciousness, tell me, how could you keep consciousness stuck inside? Does consciousness have physicality? As we just saw. If it has no physicality, what is the mechanism to keep that consciousness stuck inside your body? It's just unreasonable. Yet we cling to that notion because consciousness fools us. We feel like we're consciousness stuck inside the body. Don't be fooled. It's arbitrary. That's what my whole funny examples were about. Okay, so it was just to root this very lofty discussion, to root a little bit in our ordinary experience. Let's continue. Manau prakashyate yadvata, manau prakashyate yadvata, raktadyakarata tape, raktadyakarata tape, mayi sandrishyate sarvam, mayi sandrishyate sarvam, atape nevatanmaya, atape nevatanmaya. Manau, and connected at the end of the last line, tape. Money here means a gem. And a gem here, which is tape, in the sunlight, has other meanings as well. But we're talking about a gem in the sunlight, and in that gem, prakashyate, there appears rakta adi akarata, redness, etc. So this is the equivalent of the gem. This is a metaphor. So he says that if you have a red flower behind the gem, the redness of the flower appears in the clear gem. This is the sense of the metaphor. You've heard me use this many times. Shankara is using it in a different way here. Nice. We get to see something different. So we often use this to demonstrate how the orangeness of the cloth belongs to the cloth and not to the gem. Shankara is using this metaphor in a different way right now. Because if this cloth were behind this crystal and all the lights in this room were out, if it were dark in this room, would you see orangeness? So that's Shankara's point here, and that is, in order to see the orangeness of this cloth in the crystal, you require light. That's what Shankara says. Manao, when that crystal is tape, could also be atape, when it is in the sunlight. It is because of the sunlight. So when I've used this metaphor again and again, and Shankara also uses it in this more traditional way, the more traditional way is we describe a dhyasa superimposition like this. The orangeness that belongs to the cloth gets superimposed on the crystal. But here, Shankara's shifting our perspective using this drishtanta, this metaphor, in a different way. And he says, all of this can only take place in the presence of light. Guess what that light represents? Consciousness. So here in this metaphor, the crystal represents your mind. The cloth represents vrittis. The color of the cloth represents the nature of your vrittis. So suppose you have a sad vritti. Sad vritti is like orange cloth. The orangeness of the cloth appears in the clear crystal. The sadness of the vritti appears to color the mind. But actually, he's shifted the metaphor here. So here, the clear crystal doesn't represent consciousness, as usually when we use this metaphor, we say the clear crystal represents pure consciousness. But now Shankara's using this metaphor differently. Take note. Here, the clear crystal represents your buddhi. So just as the orangeness of the cloth appears in the crystal, the sadness of the vritti colors the buddhi, and that is revealed by light, the light of consciousness. This is his point. So he says, just as redness, etc., appear in that crystal when the crystal is illumined by the sun. He says, in the same way, yadvat, in the same way, second line, sarvam, everything, sandrishyate, appears, mayi, in me, when it is atapena eva maya, when it is illumined by maya, by me, atapena eva. I am like, that word eva is important here, like the sun. It says, I illumine everything that arises in this mind is illumined by me like the sun. Like the sun illumines the crystal, and you can see redness and other things in the crystal. In the same way, whatever arises in this mind, whatever colors the mind, is illumined by me. And this brings us to a very important teaching you've heard me say before. Many people struggle with sadness. Sadness colors our mind. Sadness colors all of our experience. When you're sad, everything feels sad. Whatever is happening feel sad. You see the world through the lens of your sadness. You see yourself and your family through the lens of sadness, so to speak. And that's really unfortunate, because then that sadness pervades your experience. That sadness is a coloring of your mind, your buddhi, your intellect, and it's known to you. You are the unchanging, uncolored, unaffected consciousness that illumines the sadness. The sadness, you're just following this whole chapter, the sadness belongs to your mind, not to you. This particular teaching can transform your life, because people get obsessed with the problem of sadness. Oh, I'm so sad, or I'm so this, I'm so that, whatever it is. All of that belongs to your mind. The purpose of these teachings is to empower you so that you can distinguish the difference between you, the knower, and the sadness in your mind, which is known, and so that you can recognize that your consciousness, the consciousness which is your essential nature, is utterly unaffected by that sadness in your mind. Think of how that can this one teaching, and this is just one of how many teachings? This one teaching can transform your life when you just get it. Okay, sadness is present in the mind. Tell me, here's the problem. Suppose you want a clear crystal. You don't like the color orange. Boy, am I in trouble if you don't like the color orange. Anyway, suppose you don't like the color orange. I want a clear crystal. Get rid of the orange. But the orangeness remains. And you're upset because the orangeness remains. The alternative, of course, is to recognize the fact, the truth, that the crystal remains clear in spite of the appearance of orangeness. It's just an appearance. It's just sadness. It's like a cloud drifting in front of the sun. Everything gets dark and gloomy, and then it drifts away. Why make such a big deal of it? Sadness. Why make such a big deal of sadness when you know it's just a passing mood? It's just an appearance in your mind. Okay, enough. Good. Next. Buddhau drishyam bhaved buddhau. Buddhau drishyam bhaved buddhau. Satyam nasti viparyaye. Satyam nasti viparyaye. Drashta yasmat sada drashta. Drashta yasmat sada drashta. Tasmad dvaitam na vidyate. Tasmad dvaitam na vidyate. Pure Vedanta. Shankara expresses it so brilliantly here. Buddhau drishyam. Drishyam, that which is seen, referring to the world of duality, that which is experienced. The world of duality, where does that experience take place? Buddhau, in your mind, in your intellect. The experience of duality takes place in your intellect when, bhavet, it takes place, buddhau satyam, when your intellect is present. The experience of duality takes place in your buddhi when the buddhi is present. When is the buddhi present? Well, right now, waking state, jagrata avastha, And at night when you're dreaming, swapna avastha, so during the waking state and the dream state, your buddhi is present, and therefore the experience of duality takes place in your buddhi. Nasti viparyaye. But viparyaye in the other condition. What is the other condition? We've talked about waking state and dream state. What is the other condition? Dreamless sleep, sushupti. So viparyaye, in that other condition, your buddhi is not present. And when your buddhi is not present, duality goes away. Gaudapada, the Shankara's teacher's teacher, is famous for this particular argument. How real can the world of duality be if it comes and goes every single day and night? It goes away. Your experience of duality goes away every night during deep sleep. Our definition of reality is that which doesn't come and go. That's our definition. That we define reality like that. Trikala abaditam satyam. That which is satyam, real, is that which is abadita, non-negatable in the trikala, in the three states: waking, dream, and sleep. That which remains, or past, present, and future is better for this definition. So that which is non-negatable in the past, that which is non-negatable in the present, that which is non-negatable in the future. Non-negatable in the past means there was never a time when it didn't exist, therefore unborn, uncreated. Non-negatable in the future, meaning eternal, not just eternal, unchangeable, immutable. Anything that changes ceases to be what it used to be. Any kind of change is a kind of destruction and new condition. So, this is our definition of real. That which is unchanging, that which doesn't come and go. What about duality? Comes and goes every day of your life. It goes away. Gaudapada's argument is, why do you think it's so real then? What is real is what doesn't come and go. You don't come and go. And that's what he says in the second half. Yasmat, because this is so, because drashta sada drashta. Drashta, seer, referring to consciousness. Sakshi. In fact, drashta and sakshi have virtually the same meaning. Seer, witness, observer, ultimately meaning consciousness. Yasmat, because consciousness, the observer, sada drashta, because it is always the observer, tasmat, therefore, with reference to consciousness, dvaitam na vidyate. This is Gaudapada's argument. There is no duality for consciousness. Remember earlier in the class, we had knower and known. Absolute division, knower and known. Duality belongs to the known and not the knower. Your consciousness has no relationship to the world of duality. We use the word transcend. Your consciousness transcends this world of duality. Your consciousness is utterly unaffected by this world of consciousness. And again, that goes back to what we said about sadness. Atma is not affected by anything. some time ago, I made mention to the fact that in the Taittiriya Upanishad, there's a very odd expression that defines enlightenment in terms of being fearless. And on the surface, that seems like an odd connection. What do you mean? Enlightenment means being free from fear. And here's the idea. Anything that's as real as you can threaten you. A gun can threaten you. A man with a gun can certainly threaten you. How about if it's a gun in a dream or a mugger in a dream? A mugger in a dream can't threaten the waking you because it's not as real as you. Anything that's as real as you can threaten you. Anything that's not as real as you, like the example that's actually given in commentaries, is the dream lion or dream tiger. Many people have this dream of being chased by a wild animal. You're running and running. And you have that sense. You have had this sensation that your legs won't move. In a dream, you want to run, and your legs won't move. And you, oh no. Common experience in a dream. Anyway, and that lion, of course, is coming closer and closer, and it's going to kill you. And the metaphor, of course, is that lion can't hurt you because it's a dream lion. It's not as real as you. So here we go back. The known comes and goes, therefore is not very real compared to the drashta, the knower, the consciousness, which doesn't come and go. Consciousness doesn't come and go, so it's much more real than whatever you experience, which constantly comes and goes. Therefore, the known cannot affect the knower. The known cannot threaten the knower. Therefore, from the standpoint of consciousness, there's nothing to fear. And that was the idea of that passage in the Taittiriya Upanishad. Okay, last verse. These chapters are so short. Avivekat parabhavam, avivekat parabhavam, yatha buddhiravaitata, yatha buddhiravaitata, vivekatu paradanyaha, vivekatu paradanyaha, swayam chapi na vidyate, swayam chapi na vidyate. Start in the second line. Yeah. Yatha, just as, buddhihi, that's been our subject matter, if you remember the title of this chapter, buddhi arudha, that which has arisen in your mind. So he says, yatha, just as, buddhihi, the mind, the intellect, and here we're talking about the mind or intellect of an unenlightened person. Why? The first line he says, avivekat, prior to viveka, discrimination, discernment, enlightenment. So, avivekat, prior to enlightenment, yatha, just as, buddhihi, the intellect, avait, the intellect knew. What did the intellect know prior to enlightenment? Para abhavam. You have to see that in the middle. The abhavam, the absence or absence of para. And para here is paramatma, reality, supreme reality. So the absence of supreme reality, paramatma, Shankara uses interesting language here. Before enlightenment, you know What do you know? I am this little finite critter trying to eke out a little happiness in life. That's what you know. Know in quotation marks, because it's wrong. That's what Shankara is referring to here. So prior to enlightenment, in the intellect was a conclusion about the non-existence of limitless consciousness. I'm adding a lot of words to make Shankara's point clear here. Before you get enlightened, what do you conclude? I am this little critter trying to eke out some happiness in life. I am certainly not all-pervasive consciousness. This is in the intellect prior to enlightenment, tata, end of the second line, but then vivekat, after becoming enlightened, too, but after being enlightened, parat anyah swayam cha api na vidyate. After enlightenment, na vidyate, there is nothing, parat anyah. There is nothing other than the para. Here you see the para abhavam in the first line, and here na parat anyaha, nothing but para. Let me try to make it very clear. Before enlightenment, you think that there is no such thing as limitless consciousness. This is really what Shankara means to say here. He uses some complex language. I'm trying to make it really simple. Before enlightenment, you conclude, I am consciousness stuck inside this body. That's your conclusion prior to enlightenment. After enlightenment, what is the conclusion? This consciousness is all-pervasive. There's nothing but this consciousness. This consciousness is the reality pervading the universe. That is your understanding after enlightenment. But the further point that Shankara, that's kind of obvious, right? So he's describing the perspective before and after enlightenment. But in our present context, the reason Shankara is saying this, and especially at the end of this verse, is to make a very important point. Enlightenment and bondage, ignorance and knowledge, bondage and liberation are states of your mind. That's what he wants to say. That's what he wants you to understand. That prior to enlightenment, there was a condition of the mind. After enlightenment, there's a change to the condition of the mind. What happens to Atma, your true self, that consciousness, before and after enlightenment? Nothing happens to Atma. Atma, as we've discussed here before, Atma doesn't get enlightened. Advaita Vedanta is not for Atma. Advaita Vedanta is for the person who says, I suffer. That suffering is addressed by these teachings of Advaita Vedanta. Atma itself doesn't suffer. The locus of suffering is the mind. The mind is the locus of the problem. The mind is the locus of the solution. And I'll leave you just with for me, a favorite scriptural statement. Comes from a little bit of an obscure place called the Amrita Bindu Upanishad, a minor Upanishad, which says, Mana eva manushyanam karanam bandha moksha yoho. You know, I don't quote much here, but this is a favorite quote for me. It says that Mana eva, the mind alone, is the karanam, the cause. bandha mokshayoho. The mind alone is the cause. Manushyanam, for all people. Mind alone. Mana eva. That eva is so powerful in this verse. Alone. Mind alone is the cause for bandha, bondage. Bondage means being stuck in a life of suffering. And moksha, liberation, meaning here freedom from suffering. Suffering and its absence depend on the mind, which certainly explains why we use all of this powerful teaching methodology, because the problem is here in our minds. And it happens that I will just end with a funny observation. Our minds are extremely powerful, but that cuts both ways. It means that our knowledge is very powerful, and it means that our ignorance is very powerful. So ignorance in the sense that our identification with the body and mind is very powerful. The perspective that your consciousness is stuck inside the body and mind is very powerful. Your conclusion that the outside world is as real as you are, very powerful. So it cuts both ways. Mind is very powerful, means your knowledge is very powerful, but your ignorance too is very powerful. Thank goodness we have such powerful teachings to help us overcome that. Okay, we'll end with a prayer. Om sarve bhavantu sukhinaha, sarve santu niramayaha, sarve bhadrani pashyantu, ma kaschid dukkha bhag bhavet, asato ma sadgamaya, tamaso ma jyotirgamaya, mrityorma amritangamaya. Om shanti shanti shanti. Om tat sat. Very nice.